good afternoon, and welcome to another afternoon installment of Live at the Waterhole. Coming to you right at this very moment from Humphreys Dam in Kimberley. But anyway, before we get too carried away with what promises to be an exciting afternoon of wildlife content, my name is Liam Burrow, and I am the naturalist that's going to be chatting you through a couple of these waterside scenes over the next 2 hours or so. And as ever, a gentle reminder that Wild Earth and African, I do like to keep these shows as interactive as possible. So please keep your comments, questions, thoughts coming to us throughout the show. Director Chulu and myself are already standing by, waiting to hear from you. So let's see what's in store. But certainly quite a busy looking afternoon here at Humphreys Dam, with our flamingo colony and a whole collection of other water birds. But nice to see these flamingos up close doing a little bit of feeding. Yeah, that water might not look super attractive to you or me, but to these flamingos, this is paradise. The big attracting factor for them is the presence of a few specific kinds of algae on which they feed. Algae and diatoms. So yeah, this slightly brackish water in which you can see that algae is absolutely thriving makes this the ideal home for these very migratory greater and lesser flamingos. But anyway, I think it's time now to check what is in store for us over the next couple of hours in terms of the weather. So yeah, certainly looking like some fairly hot, dry conditions across most of our sub-Saharan feeds, as is fairly typical for this time of the year. Now, as I mentioned, these flamingos are not alone here. There's a bit of a mixture of other bird species along the bank. A couple of red-knobbed coots joining them in the water. I think those were Egyptian geese. Perhaps a couple of yellow-billed ducks sat on the sand in the sun. Certainly this is something of a haven for a lot of bird species. This is a protected wetland reserve here at Humphreys Dam, and an essential stopping point for many of these species. Flamingos, for example, are known to fly many thousands of kilometers across the continent of Africa in search of the ideal places that they do kind of require in order to feed properly, and perhaps even more critically, places that provide the right conditions in which they can actually breed, build a nest, lay an egg, and raise a chick. In other parts of Africa, Lake Natron, for example, in eastern Africa, their habitat is very much under threat. The human activity of soda ash mining, so mining for the minerals that occur in the soils underneath these kind of brackish water sources, are doing immense damage to the areas where these flamingos actually need to settle. So having a place like Humphreys Dam completely protected is essential. and many thousands of flamingos visit this this kind of wetland area annually, and quite a bit of breeding goes on here as well. Hello, Joan Mello. Nice to have you on board. Very happy Saturday to you as well. And yeah, stick around. Hopefully, we're in for an exciting one. Mega Man in the UK, I hope I pronounced your name correctly there, asks, there appears to be no aquatic life here at Comforts. Is the water fresh or brackish? So Mega Man, my understanding is that it's quite brackish. And those are the conditions that you actually need for that, that algae and those diatoms to actually reproduce. Yeah, certainly some fairly harsh conditions for most other bird species. But the flamingos thrive in these slightly salty waters. Yeah, quite interestingly though, while they do tend to thrive in these fairly salty, fairly acidic waters, in order to maintain a healthy set of feathers, they do have to have access to a spot somewhere nearby with a bit of fresh water in which they bathe daily. So bathing and cleaning of those feathers is essential to their survival. And I think the salt, long term, is quite damaging to them. So you'll probably find somewhere around here there's a little freshwater creek or something like that, and that's where these flamingos will travel to daily to freshen up. Yeah, they are really quite unusual looking birds, and quite bizarrely, their closest cousins in the wild live amongst the pigeons and the doves. Yeah, certainly not an easy connection to make, but apparently it is there. Hello, Joe McClellan, who I believe is coming to us all the way from Indiana in the United States. Joe, nice to have you on board with us. Welcome to Live at the Waterhole. Yeah, as I say, temperatures are soaring across many of our locations this afternoon. So hopefully it is a busy day live at the Waterhole. Certainly from my home, very close to the western boundary of the Greater Kruger National Park in South Africa's Mpumalanga province, it is a sweltering day. Nice mix of water birds there. You can very clearly see the size difference between the greater, which would be the larger species of flamingo, and the lesser, the smaller there. So two species here. Very nice wing stretch there, also showing us those beautiful sort of pink feathers, especially on the wings. And the pink coloration was originally believed to come from the bodies of little crustaceans, things like brine shrimp in the water, that the flamingos were thought to be feeding on. But recent advances in science, and certainly the way we study these things, have revealed that those color pigments actually come from carotenoids, which are kind of orange, pinkish, reddish pigments that actually originate in those algae, those diatoms that they actually feed on. Yeah, and I think quite interestingly, carotenoids are also found in things like carrots for us as humans, and even the skin of very ripe tomatoes. So Tina asks, where do flamingos nest? Tina, flamingos are terrestrial nesters. They nest on the ground in little turrets or little kind of elevated lumps that they actually have to produce themselves out of the mud. So yeah, ideally there should be an island or some sort of protected area out of the reach of predators, things like baboons, the few species of smaller wild cats that do occur in South Africa, things like caracals, servals, African wild cats. And yeah, flamingos perform this incredible group ballet display mating ritual in which mates will select one another. A male and a female will pair off and head to a selected nesting region. And then, as I say, construct one of these muddy turrets, lay an egg on top of it, share the incubation duties, and about a month later, a very vulnerable little flamingo chick hatches. And it feeds on a diet of regurgitated algae and diatoms. Yeah, the substance that they regurgitate for those chicks actually looks like blood. It's so rich in that sort of crimson red pigment. And that'll cause that chick to develop very quickly. The chicks are at immense risk of the threat of flooding. Should the water level rise, those muddy turrets are usually only maybe 6 or 7 inches above the ground surface. And of course the chicks are quite flightless for many, many weeks. So it's a bit of a race against time, especially with the way the weather in sub-Saharan Africa has been behaving lately, to get those chicks up to maturity and yeah, big and strong enough to fly. And then they will follow their parents on the next migration, which will possibly take them from Kamfer's Dam all the way up to somewhere like Lake Natron, once again in East Africa. Many thousands of kilometers, with a few stops along the way, perhaps in Namibia or Mozambique. But yeah, as I say, there are only probably 4 or 5 locations on the entire continent where these flamingos can actually settle. So these havens are very special indeed. I first viewed flamingos in Africa as a child running along a deserted beach right up in the northern section of Mozambique, South Africa's neighbor to the east. Now I was only about 10, but I can remember seeing huge flocks of these birds flying high above the beach, headed north, possibly, as I say, up to East Africa. They are such captivating and unusual looking things. And certainly when they fly, that head and neck is obviously forward, but they've got that lovely, long, gangly set of legs that project rearwards. Yeah, they certainly don't look like they would be able to fly very well, but they do. And as I say, over huge distances. Alrighty, well, in the interest of keeping things moving, I think we will leave our really fascinating colony of flamingos and others and head down to Stony Point on our Cape South coast. beautiful. So check this little guy out. I'm going to have to pick up a book and confirm exactly what species of lizard this is. But it is almost certainly one of the girdled lizard species. Highly adapted to life among the crevices in these rocks. You can see those very peeled scales on his back. That's an anti-predator mechanism. So if this lizard is pursued by something that wants to eat him, he'll shove himself into a little crevice and inflate his lungs with a big gasp of air, and those fairly sharp scales jab into the rock. So if something was to grab him by the tail and try and pull him backwards, that is an almost impossible task. So I'm just going to pick up a reptile book on my bookshelf. Let's see if we can tell the exact species of girdled lizard. South Africa is home to an enormous diversity of reptile species. So very cool to be taking a look at some of these smaller stuff. As I say, we do try to look at things here live at the waterhole and with Wild Earth as holistically as possible. It's not all about the big stuff, and I think there's an enormous amount of magic in the little things. Alrighty, so that was a Cape girdled lizard. It's the first time I've ever seen one of those. And we do get a couple of different species, one or two in my neck of the woods. But a Cape girdled lizard, a nice find. Once again though, we are here at Stony Point Nature Reserve in Betty's Bay, quite close to the city of Cape Town. And checking things out amongst the rocks here. There is, after all, a very active colony of rock hyraxes, which are known as dassies to some South Africans. And on occasion we are, there's one of our girdled lizards just on the rock. Occasionally also presenting us with views of the local African penguins. Joan Mello says, Stony Point is my favourite place. It's certainly a very nice part of the world, Joan. I'll be down in Cape Town in about 2 or 3 weeks. So looking forward to spending a bit of time along this coast. It makes a nice contrast to my home in South Africa's Lowveld, also a beautiful part of the world. Cecilia Henderson says, I love the sounds of the ocean. Absolutely, Cecilia. There's got to be a therapeutic quality to the sound of those crashing waves and that calming sea breeze. Yeah, there is immense value in spending time in nature in its various forms. It's food for the human soul. Couple of what look like cormorants along those rocks, also fishing birds. I wonder if these are not white-bellied cormorants. Yeah, this very cold ocean around Stony Point and certainly Betty's Bay is famous for very high fish stocks. Huge shoals of things like sardines and mackerel, which are essential food sources to these water birds. But unfortunately, many species of these water birds are now under threat. from growing pressure due to large-scale commercial fishing offshore, often by foreign nations, coming in and literally removing multiple tons of fish out of the sea at a time. Yeah, it's certainly one of the biggest pressures on our colony of totally endemic African penguins. So yeah, certainly something I wish our government would address. I think we've got to look more sustainably at the way we treat our oceans. Victor asks, how do the penguins interact with the other birds? Victor, I think fairly well. And they just kind of go about their business. Yeah. Certainly there isn't a lot of competition for space or anything like that. There are lots of nesting sites. Yeah, we will certainly continue to keep an eye out for any of those penguins, or maybe an emergence of our rock hyraxes. Yeah, the plant that you can see floating in the water back and behind these cormorants and darters is an immense kelp forest in which a lot of life also lives. So a wonderful fishing ground for many of these birds, and the center of some serious biodiversity. Ah, there's a little African penguin just heading down the beach into the water, possibly heading off for a spot of fishing, an activity which will take many hours out of their day, and may even see them heading as far as 50 kilometers offshore. So they seriously are adept swimmers. Yeah, entirely flightless birds. They have no ability to fly from land. But put a flamingo, or rather a penguin, into the water, and they almost take flight. That was certainly a very brief view, but yeah, maybe there's a penguin or two around. After a slightly overcast and drizzly day here yesterday, nice to see the sun coming out for Betty's Bay today. Still though, this ocean is mighty chilly, probably not the best place to go for a swim. Not unless you have skin like a Cape fur seal. Apologies for a slightly shaky looking feed there. I don't know if that's just on my end. Yeah, we have been gripped by some technical difficulties lately, as is often the case trying to broadcast this program live from various very remote waterside locations. I guess it all just comes with the territory. Alrighty then, perhaps a little bit too shaky there. Checking things out much further north now, in the country of Namibia, at Okakoyo in the Etosha area. Things looking pretty sleepy around the waterhole here, other than an Egyptian goose, I think. This waterhole has been a hive of activity in recent shows though. I think it's one of the few places around where wildlife can actually come out of this very arid landscape and get a bit of a drink. Now, it's also the home of a very special population of desert-adapted elephants that we have been fortunate enough to get great sightings of in the last couple of months. I haven't seen them recently, but yeah, that's not to say they couldn't show up at any moment. There is some movement of some big herbivores in the back there, possibly some wildebeest, a zebra or gemsbok. A little bit tricky to say though, they're quite far off. Africa, after all, is something of a land of extremes. From areas like Tembe Elephant Park, which at the moment look like a tropical paradise. Etosha is a stark contrast, but pretty phenomenal that even with a few meager resources, a life even here can thrive. A testament to the resilience and the fortitude of so many of our wild species. Looks like a couple of springbok just starting to materialize between those white rocks on the right hand side there. The springbok are amongst our most desert adapted animals, in many areas quite capable of going extended periods between trips to the waterhole. But of course, if water is available, they will drink regularly. Yeah, it does look like a couple of plains zebra coming down as well, way off there in the distance. I apologize, we don't have much of a zooming ability at this camera. I think something to do with the way it is mounted. And if we do any zooming at all, very often it gets extremely shaky. I think it gets caught by the wind, and then the picture is very unstable. Super. Well, a nice thing, or a nice look at things here at Okakoyo. We may check in here a little bit later, but I think time now to check in at what's happening in Madikwe. So just arriving here at Jamala Waterhole here in Madikwe, and a large private game reserve up on South Africa's northernmost boundary with neighbouring Botswana to the north. And it is a hive of activity today. A couple of warthogs on the opposite side, a number of giraffes streaming in and out, and of course ever-present herds of our favourite grey pachyderms. My favourite anyway. I've spent many thousands of hours viewing African elephants in the wild over the last 12 years, and still spending time with ellies, I see new and interesting behaviour all the time. Check out that youngster having a nice scratch of his rump on that well-placed rock. Also another group of plains zebra, I think giving these ellies a bit of a wide berth there. Elephants, after all, are the commanding presence here around the waterhole, and they do seem to take priority. Thankfully, though, as mentioned in earlier shows, elephants have a full-time job, especially when conditions are as dry as this, collecting enough food to survive. So these trips to the waterhole don't last forever. Inevitably, the elephants will be compelled by the driving force that is their elephant-sized hunger to head off and graze, head off and browse, and then the other wildlife will get the gap to come in and have their drink. With temperatures in excess of 30 degrees Celsius here at Jamala today, and as you can see, not a cloud in the sky. Things certainly are hotting up. So this is the perfect time of the day for these ellies to come down and engage in a bit of mud wallowing, a bit of roughhousing in the water. That certainly does look cooling and refreshing. Now, this does seem to be a bit of a mixed group. There is certainly a breeding herd mixed in here, and a number of sub-adult bulls as well. Quite possibly sons of some of the females here, but many of these males will no longer be permanent family members. For this exact reason, they get quite boisterous as they kind of go through the ordeal that is puberty. As that testosterone starts to come in, there's lots of pushing, shoving, and possibly even a little bit of reproductive interest in some of the female family members, which may pose the threat of a bit of inbreeding. So a natural built-in mechanism to their society is that the cows start putting pressure on them to move out and start their own lives as bachelors. And that's probably for the best. These lumbering giants could quite easily catch a very small calf underfoot while they're doing some of this roughhousing, this wrestling. And yeah, certainly from there, the bulls all gravitate towards one another. They're forming a nice bachelor society in which they support one another. And from there, when they hit the age of about 35, if they are big and strong and dominant enough, they may have the opportunity once again to return to one of those breeding herds to mate. Tracy asks a very good question. Hello, Tracy. Will Ellie bulls remember their original herd? Almost certainly, Tracy. So obviously we've all heard the saying, an elephant never forgets, and they are famous for possibly one of the greatest memories in the animal kingdom. Certainly far greater capacity than even us as humans. And certainly in studies conducted in elephant herds in East Africa, I'm thinking of Amboseli National Park specifically, by a team of female scientists out there that have been monitoring elephants around the clock for something like 60 years. It's well documented that adult bulls will return for fairly peaceful and gentle visits to the herds that they were born into. They are such phenomenal animals. And very much part of what it means to be an elephant is this social structure. And when they are kept in captivity, and specifically elephants kept alone, they live a hollow, miserable existence. In order for an elephant to have any chance to live a happy, full life, it has to have the ability to mingle with other elephants. Now, this isn't mating that we're actually looking at. This is just sort of playful wrestling behavior between two bulls. Just testing one another, the bigger one kind of impressing his dominance onto that slightly smaller individual. And that's how their hierarchy is slowly but surely formed. The very biggest, very strongest bulls hold the highest positions and certainly take the lion's share of the mating opportunities. And that's nature's way of ensuring that only the very strongest of genetic material proliferates into the next generation, confirming Darwin's theories of evolution. Survival of the fittest. Nice. Well, in that little gap between these groups of ellies at the back there, a couple of plains zebra finding their chance to come in for a quick drink as well. Sure, what an African scene. I think this might actually even be a bachelor herd of zebra. There's certainly a lot of kicking and nipping going on. Now, zebra society can be quite vicious. Very often we see them missing ears, missing tails, and with fairly significant wounds in their hides. Many naturalists are very quick to say, oh yeah, that zebra survived an interaction with a lion. And sometimes they do. Oh, excuse me, they do. But very often, I think those wounds have been inflicted by another zebra stallion. And of course, a number of southern giraffe just in those acacia thickets at the back there, doing a bit of feeding as they move down. Giraffe tend to be quite shy around the waterhole, so with ellies making a lot of noise and pushing and shoving, they tend to hang back. But maybe we'll get them down here in a bit. Sure, that is a very pale looking giraffe, very light skinned. And there is an enormous amount of variation in the patterns and the coloration of these giraffes, and it varies from individual to individual. Certainly some of the very oldest males can be almost black in color. Yeah, it's actually reckoned that the pigment melanin, which is a very dark black or brown pigment, in a couple of different animal species is affected by testosterone. So the higher the testosterone levels, and we would expect very high testosterone levels in an adult male, the much darker the skin. Similar is also true in lions. So a very dominant male lion out of a coalition is usually the one with the darkest mane. It's not a total rule, though. I think in some cases it comes down to the animal's genes. Some, I guess, a bit like us as humans, are darker than others. Tracy Merrill says, a beautiful scene. Well, certainly it is, Tracy. What a pleasure. At least 7 giraffes there. That's wonderful. Yeah, in an earlier segment I said these were acacia thickets. I think they're actually purple pod terminalia trees, of which giraffes, quite fascinatingly, are one of the biggest pollinators. Now, these trees are not flowering at the moment, but when they do, they rely quite heavily on the very hairy faces of the giraffes being stuck in amongst the branches to feed on the leaves. The giraffes inevitably get coated in a very heavy layer of pollen, which they carry from tree to tree, spreading on other blossoms. And as a result, this terminalia forest can produce seeds. Loads of giraffes. That's epic. Certainly a very large bull in the center there, towering above the other giraffe in this group. He is, after all, the tallest mammal to walk anywhere on land. It's something like 5.5 meters tall at the top of those ossicones, those bony projections on the top of his skull. Ray asks an interesting question. What is the conservation status of giraffes? So, Ray, it kind of varies across their various distributions in the places where they do range in Africa. Once again, there are reckoned to be 9 separate subspecies of giraffe in Africa. And the southern giraffe, which is the subspecies that we're looking at the moment, is probably the most common. And they seem to be reasonably widespread across many of our wilderness areas. But look at other populations, something like the Rothschild's giraffe in East Africa, down to a couple of hundred individuals. And even something like the Kordofan giraffe, which lives in places like Sudan, if I'm not mistaken, down to even less than that. So, yeah, in many areas, these large animals are very threatened indeed. They're not necessarily poached for anything specifically. No part of their bodies is particularly in demand in the black market, to my knowledge. But I think in areas where they do come into conflict with people, they are sometimes killed for their meat. Yeah, they're particularly vulnerable to snaring. Yeah, check those ellies out in the water there. Almost completely submerged in what is quite a shallow, muddy waterhole. Yeah, we haven't been seeing a whole lot of proper elephant swimming or wallowing lately. So nice to see these guys taking a bit of a plunge. They are entirely at home in the water, and even deep water. Of course, they come with a built-in snorkel in the form of that trunk. They've also got a very gassy stomach system, leading them to be quite bloated, but that means that they float very well indeed. There are reckoned to be populations of elephants in some parts of Southeast Asia that will even cross sections of ocean between islands, quite happily swimming amongst the waves with that trunk elevated above the surface. And that hints at some of elephants' closest relatives in the wild, which are, of course, the hyraxes, which we see at Stony Point, but otherwise things like the dugong or manatee, very aquatic, fresh and saltwater animals. So, ellies love to spend some time in the water. Those cheeky youngsters at the back demonstrating a lot of aggressive body language there. I think they're just excitable, but perhaps trying to threaten those impala off to the one side as well. Young elephants go through a very pronounced phase of almost like a short man syndrome. A small stature, but lots of attitude. It's only with time and certainly them packing on a bit of weight, a bit of size, that they find that elephant confidence that is so characteristic of the enormous 6 or 7 ton adult bulls. Goodness me, loads of elephants coming out here. Again, this is not one family group. You probably find there are at least 2 breeding herds here and a number of groups of bachelors, but all converging where the resources are so good. And this is a wonderful melting pot for elephant society, a wonderful social gathering point in which herds can mingle, individuals can meet one another, and possibly males even get the opportunity here to test a couple of these females in terms of their receptiveness to mating. When a female elephant does ovulate, the window in which she can actually fall pregnant is remarkably small, probably just a couple of days. So bulls certainly do need to gain access to that female in order to successfully fertilize that egg. Catherine says a swimming elephant would be a sight to see. Absolutely it is, Catherine. It's worth Googling. There's some phenomenal footage out there. I'm trying to think of which documentary it was in, but certainly one of the most recent specials filmed in the Okavango Delta of elephants swimming from below. Yeah, you certainly wouldn't think they'd be great swimmers looking at their feet, which look like the bottoms of like big pillars or something. But they're obviously quite effective at paddling through the water with those big broad legs. Now there are a number of elephants here of varied different colors. Now the skin of all of these elephants is the same. It's sort of slate grey when it's dry. But of course elephants do love to spend a bit of time splashing mud onto those skins. So they do tend to take on the colours of the soil wherever they've bathed. And in some parts of the world they can be snow white. We see that in Etosha with the very chalky soils. In other parts of the world, notably places like Old Donyo and perhaps Savo National Park in East Africa, with very rusty, oxidized soils, the elephants become almost blood red. A wildlife photographer's dream. A lone wildebeest bull also coming down on the opposite side for a bit of a drink. We're getting such a magnificent look at some biodiversity today, certainly of the megafauna, the bigger species that do live here in Madikwe. There must be over 30 elephants at the water at the moment. That's amazing. This young elephant curiously investigating this peculiar beast that is the wildebeest. Certainly trying her luck at a bit of intimidation there. That wildebeest wasn't phased though, he's too thirsty. I think a lot of this aggression around the waterhole that we do see from the elephants directed at all the other species, I think a lot of it is for the fun of it. There certainly is a comical side to a lot of those interactions. Yeah, Ellies, after all, being highly intelligent, very emotional animals, have a bit of a comical side, I'd say, maybe even a sense of humor. Looks like yet another breeding herd emerging from that thicket at the back there, being greeted by some others that were here already. Yeah, possibly even an extended family. Two sets of a greater breeding herd that is split. Lots of heads up at the back there. I'm sure there's a bit of vocalizing going on. That is an elephant greeting. A family reunion, if you will. There's a slightly contentious issue at the moment with the presence of things like African and Asian elephants in captivity in zoos in parts of the developed world. North America, parts of Europe. And yeah, certainly from my perspective anyway, and having only viewed wild elephants, I wouldn't want to see them any other way. Ellies that do live in captivity, especially in fairly confined conditions, and as mentioned earlier, occasionally elephants kept all on their own, I think live quite a sad, depressing, frustrating life. For an animal as intelligent and as emotional as this, they need to be out here, interacting with others, roaming over hundreds of miles in search of food. Much like some of the bigger cetaceans, orcas, things like that, these are animals that need to live in the wild. And I think a great deal of human perception when it comes to the way we treat animals and the way we view animals in captivity has shifted over the last 50 or 60 years. We've moved away, thankfully, from seeing animals performing for us in things like circuses. And I think for certain species, changes need to happen in those zoos as well. By all means, the elephants that already exist there should be allowed to live out their lives, perhaps in sanctuaries where they can retire. But I think the days of breeding those elephants in captivity should be over. Now, if you want to see Ellies, come out to the wild. Come out on a safari and view them where they belong. That's, of course, not to say that zoos don't serve a very vital and valuable role in our society, in our cities. Certainly they are essential for inspiring the next generation of humans to care about wildlife and view the importance of animals in the scheme of biodiversity. But for certain species, they just don't do. Killer whales, big intelligent elephants, things like some of the great primates just don't belong there. Some slightly lumpy formations on the skin of this large bull. Those might be something like sebaceous cysts. Not quite sure what has caused that. Possibly even a thorn or something that's got stuck under the skin and has ended up trapped in a pocket of fluid, something like that. Thankfully, they don't seem to be causing too much irritation. They're certainly not open or oozing or anything like that. So no real means for concern, I would say. You can see that other breeding herd which we witnessed arriving a couple of minutes ago. They're kind of hanging back at the water's edge there. You'll notice amongst a fortress of legs there are a number of very small calves. And quite perceptively, I think these adult females leading them down have made the decision just to hang back until this crowd in the water disperses a little bit. So certainly there is something of an order, even a cue, down to the proceedings at the water's edge. Those calves, after all, are quite vulnerable, and in the chaos of some of these bulls pushing and shoving and whatnot, these cows just don't want to risk it. They are, after all, some of nature's finest mums. Apologies there. I think our feed at Madikwe froze very briefly there. We'll keep an eye on it and see what happens. But we are, of course, live once again from a fairly quiet-looking Tosha, Okakoyo in Namibia. Yeah, now my monitor is probably not as high quality as the screen you're viewing it on. I can only really just see a little bit of movement amongst those white calcrete rocks on the top right-hand side there, which I believe to be a couple of springbok moving around close to the water there. Springbok once occurred in southern Africa in absolutely vast numbers, and a springbok migration rivaling the great wildebeest migration in East Africa in terms of size used to occur here. But unfortunately, with the way southern Africa has developed, certainly a few more million people live in the area, so hence the need for farms and fences and roads and cities and all sorts of things. Those springbok numbers are quite greatly reduced. You can, however, still see great herds of them, perhaps not quite as great as 1.5 million, but yeah, certainly into the hundreds in some of the more arid regions of the Kalahari, the Namib. After all, they are highly adapted desert specialists. Wesley asks, is there ever any green here? Certainly there is, Wesley. So while Okakoyo doesn't get a whole lot of rainfall, when it is lucky enough to get a day or two of rain, an inch or two on the surface, this place bursts into life. There are many species of plants out here that can lay dormant for literally a decade. Their little seeds almost desiccated and dried out in that fairly barren-looking sand. When given a bit of moisture, they just bust into life. Yeah, and some parts of this very arid part of the world can be carpeted in a colourful coat of wild flowers, which bring with them a whole host of insects and other species to pollinate them. And then they all race to try and produce seed once again. Everything dies back, and it remains dormant maybe again for years at a time. And such is very often true in many of Africa's deserts. There's life all around, just waiting for the opportunity. I said on the Live at the Waterholes show yesterday, it boggles my mind that large herbivores can occur here at all, especially looking at something as large as an elephant or perhaps a giraffe, that they would even have the opportunity to find enough food to survive out here. Is pretty mind-boggling. And certainly, I think many of these species that occur here have to work a great deal harder to survive, simply to find enough resources to survive than in other parts of Africa. But a very nice look at these two springbok. I think a ram on the right, possibly a ewe on the left. Their horns are slightly different. The rams tend to be more bulky, quite thicker. The ewes a little skinnier, a bit more delicate. And once again, not to be confused with species of gazelle that occur in other parts of Africa. Places like East Africa are home to a whole list of gazelle species, the Thompson's gazelle perhaps being the most common. But if you look to the springbok's scientific name, which is Antidorcus marsupialis, a bit of a mouthful, but break it up. Antidorcus quite literally means not gazelle. So they are kind of a thing all on their own. And marsupialis refers to the pouch of a very fluffy white fur on the rump, which you can kind of just see when they do turn and point their backside at you. But that pouch of white fluff is very apparent when springbok pronk or do that very particular jumping display of fitness and health that they actually get their name from, the springbok or the jumping goat, the jumping antelope. Kim asks, what other antelope species occur here? Quite a long list of antelope species, Kim, from some of the smallest in terms of things like steenbok and duiker, and then the very largest are things like eland, those gemsbok. We do see wildebeest, red hartebeest as well, another nice one. Yeah, I have on occasion seen impala here as well, but yeah, you don't usually expect impala to live in a place that springbok actually occur in. The springbok are known as a hard water species. They tend to live in areas where the water is quite brackish, quite salty. The impala, in contrast, are soft water antelope. They occur in areas like South Africa's Lowveld where the water is soft. It's not salty at all. Yeah, and impala are certainly on the lower end in terms of tolerance of these very arid, dry conditions. But it is proof that there is good grazing around. Yeah, this Etosha, or rather Okakoyo waterhole, certainly is an oasis out in a fairly dry, barren landscape. A harsh place. Sandra asks, any aquatic plants that these springbok may feed on as they enter the water? Quite possibly, Sandra. While I haven't witnessed it myself, we certainly get one or two species of birds here. We've seen things like little grebes, which feed on insects that occur in aquatic plants. So there must be some sort of greenery growing in these waterholes. Yeah, it certainly stands to reason that a hungry springbok might nibble on those a little bit. Never say never. Sarah asks a very good question. Do these white rocks not hurt the animals as they travel to the water? Hello, Sarah. Nice to have you joining us. No, I don't think it's too much of an issue for them. It might look like a fairly rocky and treacherous landscape, and certainly for you or I, should we be walking around out there for whatever reason barefoot, that might be a fairly uncomfortable experience. But certainly for things like antelope, they're very dexterous in terms of the way that they move, and their hooves are also very well adapted to harsh terrain, harsh substrates. Something like an elephant, though, with fairly sensitive foot pads, would probably prefer to avoid those rocks. And certainly in the areas that I've operated in as a guide and a naturalist, if we want to keep elephants away from anything, maybe like a pump or a well quite close to the water's edge, you just pile rocks around it and the ellies avoid it. But yeah, thanks for your question, Sarah. Always nice to have younger viewers joining us. Alrighty, well, in the absence of much large life to speak of here at Okakoyo in Namibia, I think we may once again take a bit of a trip down to Stony Point in the Cape to see what's happening on the beach. So back once again here at Stony Point in Betty's Bay, quite close to the city of Cape Town in South Africa's Cape. And we've got a number of rock hyraxes basking in the sun. Now, with fairly cool conditions here along the coast, even though the sun is shining, the temperature is quite low, low 20s, with quite a bit of wind coming off of the sea. This spot presents a wonderful place these small mammals to warm up a little bit, defrost before they head off for a bit of grazing among the succulent plants that grow on these rocks. And we've been seeing a lot of interesting smaller things here at Stony Point of late. Only a couple of minutes ago we saw a nice close-up view of a cape-girdled lizard, a very special lizard species. And of course always the promise of catching a glimpse of one of our African penguins, an endemic and highly endangered species. Another lizard scurrying across the rock in the top left corner of the screen there. I believe that to be a rock agama, though. Quite different to that cape-girdled lizard. Yeah, certainly these hyraxes attract quite a few flies, which will be coming in for the smell of their droppings, I'm sure. And those flies provide an excellent food source for many of the lizards. And the lizards in turn will feed things like cat cobras, which definitely occur in the area as well. So yeah, there is life all around. And quite interesting to see the interconnected nature of the entire system. Well, that's biodiversity. Yeah, so as mentioned only a couple of minutes ago, these rock hyraxes in Africa are the closest relative of our elephants. Isn't that bizarre? Yeah, you'd be forgiven for thinking these hyraxes were closer connections of things like guinea pigs or maybe rats, but they are not rodents at all. LG7 says, Liam, you always have a great way of explaining things for us to learn new things. Thanks very much, LG7. It's very kind of you. Yeah, I'm happy you're enjoying it. Bill Myrtle Beach says, I remember the first time I saw one there, I thought they were just big rats, laugh out loud. Then I learned what they were. Such cool little guys. And they certainly are, Bill, and thanks for your comment. Yeah, very unusual little mammals. I say little, they're only sort of 2 or 3 kilos in size, perhaps a little heavier for a slightly bigger one. It's sort of not much smaller than a very little Jack Russell dog. They're tiny things, but very well adapted to life amongst these boulders, where they will seek shelter in these crevices from some of their biggest predators, among others things like the Varroa eagle or the black eagle, which specializes almost exclusively in making meals out of tasty rock hyraxes. And then they are fed upon by things like the smaller Cape leopard and the caracals that do live along this Cape coast as well. It is a wild area. There's an immense amount of life out there. I think we were zooming in on those hyrax toes that were just sticking up from in that crevice. The owner of those toes has obviously pulled them back in. Lion 8 asks, are there many sightings of orcas and white sharks in the waters near and around Stony Point in Betty's Bay? Lion 8, certainly there have been a lot of sightings of the orcas of late. There was actually believed to be a bit of an issue in recent times with some visiting orcas almost wiping out the population of great white sharks. I believe I read they were killing them and eating their pancreases, which is a bit weird. But yeah, it seems like those orcas may, for the moment, have at least moved on, and hopefully those white sharks, those great white sharks, are making a bit of a comeback. Yeah, this coastline, boasting one of the greatest densities of fur seals in the planet, is the perfect habitat for large oceanic predators like the orca and like those great white sharks. Yeah, an amazing, amazing part of the world, and a bit mind-boggling to think that this is only like a 2.5 or 3 hour flight from South Africa's Kruger National Park. So you can go from some of the greatest high-profile species viewing in terms of kind of looking for big cats and the big five and elephants and buffalo and things like that. Hop on an aeroplane and you could be looking at great white sharks and orcas in the same day. a testament to the varied landscape that we do have here in South Africa. It's one of those things that makes this one of the most popular tourist destinations on the world, or in the world rather. Yeah, thank goodness for tourism. It's certainly one of our biggest economies. A nice close-up look at the faces of these two sunbathing rock hyraxes. And as mentioned in an earlier segment, they are entirely herbivorous, feeding exclusively on plant material, much like their elephant cousins. And they do seem to like to feed on things like the fairchies, a species of succulent that grows along the sort of earthy patches between these big boulders. Now we get at least two species of hyrax in South Africa, the rock hyrax that we're looking at the moment, and then another species adapted to areas which are perhaps not so rocky, and those are tree hyraxes that utilize those phenomenal climbing, scrambling skills to find the tastiest shoots very high up in the canopies of trees. A little bit before I was born, my late grandmother actually hand-raised a little orphaned hyrax baby, which used to follow her around the house. Quite a little character from the stories I've heard. But one fact of hyrax biology is that they always visit the bathroom in the same place. So in order to keep the house nice and clean, she trained this little hyrax to sort of visit the bathroom on a paper towel on a saucer. And then that could obviously be tipped into the loo, tipped into the toilet, and flushed away quite hygienically. But this little hyrax, obviously driven by quite a strong sense of smell, I think made the connection between the bathroom and the business of relieving oneself. So sort of cut out the middleman, and for a little while this little hyrax would jump up onto the toilet seat and do its business in the loo, which was obviously very funny and I guess even more convenient. But unfortunately my gran was out one day and this poor little hyrax fell into the loo and lost its life. So that was the end of that story. Yeah, as ever, wild animals belong in the wild. Very often they are not suited to a life under captive and certainly domestic home conditions. This one on the rock certainly is a very chunky looking individual. Check out that belly. Very well fed if it's not a pregnant female. So these little rock hyraxes are also quite territorial animals. The territories are demarcated using scent by adult males and a single colony of a male, a number of subordinate males, and then a number of females and young, maybe as large as 25 individuals. And yeah, they certainly do seem to be quite prolific here at Stony Point Nature Reserve. So they can give birth to something like 6 youngsters under the right conditions if the mum is very healthy, after a pretty long gestation period for such a small mammal, well over 200 days of pregnancy. And then they're apparently active from the very earliest of stages. They can basically run around from the get-go, feeding on a mix of mom's milk and vegetation from day one. Really interesting little mammals. And other than Stony Point Nature Reserve here, there aren't too many places where we can get a view of these guys here at Live at the Waterhole. So Silly Jilly asks, where do you find the tree hyraxes that you mentioned? Silly Jilly, good afternoon. So there are a number of different tree hyrax species living in Africa, but the southern tree hyrax we get in southern Africa can be found in some parts of KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, up through parts of the Kruger National Park, into Mozambique, and yeah, certainly in my home country of Zimbabwe, and then further north up into Malawi, Zambia. So yeah, perhaps not something we see very, very commonly in South Africa itself. Yeah, but an interesting variation on this rock hyrax. One of the gulls, I'm not sure exactly which one, perhaps a grey-backed gull, something like that. Also very commonly seen amongst these rocks, foraging for little fish, crustaceans, mollusks. this ocean around the Cape, which is, after all, a mix of a very cold current which comes down the western coast, down from Namibia, mixing with a very warm current coming down from the opposite side along the Mozambican coastline. It results in a tremendous kind of mixing effect, coupled with lots of frontal movements and winds and pressure systems coming from kind of the furthest reaches of the southern hemisphere, the polar area. Results in some fairly turbulent conditions. They are, for many of the species that live on the coast or in the sea surrounding the coast, also not necessarily an easy place to live. Another land of extremes. When the wind picks up here, it can blow a gale for days with very, very chilly temperatures, quite a lot of rain. So yeah, I guess for many of these species, this is really a nice day. Alrighty, I think in the interest of keeping things moving, perhaps now to check on a new location for the afternoon, let's head up to my home country of Zimbabwe to see what's happening up at Victoria Falls. Apologies, rather Lisbon Falls, which is on the Mpumalanga Highveld of South Africa's eastern regions. Isn't that gorgeous? So the river system feeding into this creek is the Lisbon Creek, very close to the town of Sabi. Yeah, I've actually been up to these waterfalls in person a number of times with guests. There's a phenomenal local helicopter charter company servicing a lot of the lodges that offers the most tremendous scenic flights along this whole system, and there are plenty of waterfalls. And then, you have the option to kind of land up here and have a picnic next to one of these waterfalls, which is very cool. So certainly, if you ever are in the area, Sunrise Helicopter Services is the one to use. And yeah, this waterfall falls throughout the year. It seems to be, a very permanent feature in the landscape. Yeah, icy cold river though, not perhaps the best for swimming. The temperature in that water is probably something like 15 degrees Celsius. So once again, unless you have furry coating or a layer of blubber like a fur seal, it's probably not going to be the most comfortable swim. Now this area, which rises a couple of thousand foot above the Lowveld, where we see things like the Kruger National Park, kind of in the flatlands below, offers a pretty varied habitat in terms of the species it can actually support. So we do see some very interesting species up here. There's a very well established population of bushbuck, which I have seen from the air. And having things like bushbuck, I have no doubt that there may be the odd leopard rustling around in these incredible forests. Lisbon Falls is also a great area for the breeding of things like the bald ibis, a very, very endangered species of bird which occurs up here. So yeah, thankfully these areas are very well protected. There's no chance of any further human development in them. And long may they remain as sort of a last stronghold for a couple of those very special species. Yeah, so once again, a very gentle reminder that this show is obviously completely live, very much unscripted, and the whole idea behind it is to keep it as interactive as possible. So please keep your questions, comments, thoughts, etc. coming to us throughout the show. And Director Nadine and myself are standing by waiting to hear from you. Alrighty, well, again, I think in the absence of much wildlife, let's head to another location. Let's check back in with the flamingos at Comfers Dam. So a pretty sleepy looking scene here from Comfers Dam, with a lot of our flamingos, I think, starting to slow down, just doing a bit of preening, some feather maintenance, and a couple of those individuals even having a nap on one leg. Quite fascinatingly, it's believed that a lot of water bird species, when they do engage in that kind of one-legged napping behavior, are actually engaging in a process which allows them to rest one half of their brain at a time. Which sounds a bit peculiar, but makes enough sense, wanting to stay at least partially alert in order to spot predators. Now, one of the biggest threats for these flamingos would be predation by raptors, birds of prey, which would be coming from above. So quite literally, it pays to sleep with one eye open. A couple of slightly late comments coming in now about Lisbon Falls. Liverpool Bird asks, is there anything living within or at the bottom of the falls? Certainly Liverpool Bird. So as I said, that water is very, very cold, around 15 degrees Celsius. But there are still a few species of trout that do very well in that chilly water. Certainly some freshwater crabs, things like the African clawed toad. South Africans refer to it as a platana, a fully aquatic species of frog. They thrive there. A couple of the rana frogs as well. I certainly saw them in that river as a kid. River frogs. So yeah, by all means, there's lots of life out there. Shanae in the UK says, all these new locations are amazing to see. Do you have a favorite? Shanae, I think for me, Old Donyo is probably my favorite. But yeah, I guess it's pretty tricky to choose. They all are all so different, and each location kind of offers something different. Spas Ikonov, good afternoon. Spas says, first time seeing the Lisbon Falls. Beautiful place. Do we see any wildlife here, Liam? Yeah, certainly, Spas. As I say, from a helicopter, I've certainly seen things like bushbuck up there, duiker, another one of the smaller antelope. So it's well within the realm of possibility that you might have things like leopards occurring up in those forests with ample antelope, plenty of water. Yeah, it's also a pretty well protected area up in a system of forestry plantations. So the perfect place for something like that to live. And of course, other than mammals, plenty of birds up there. Bald ibises, Narina trogons, lemon doves. It can be a very special place if you're interested in some of the smaller things. Sharon Grant, who I believe is a new member, says, do flamingos only breed during certain seasons or all year round? Sharon Grant, no. To my understanding, the flamingo breeding season is fairly structured. They breed at a certain time of the year. I think it's heavily reliant on conditions. So the flamingos have to have the right availability of resources like food, and certainly the water has to be low enough for them to construct their nests up on the muddy banks. So yeah, the peak breeding season is more towards the end of the year, November, December, January, February, for the greater and lesser flamingos. Shiv asks, are flamingos left-legged or right-legged? Do they favor one leg? Shiv, I'm not 100% sure about that. I think, once again, the behavior that we are witnessing here is simply flamingos sleeping. And they will spend about half the time sleeping on one leg and the other half sleeping on the other. Spas asks, great to see the flamingos at Cuthbert's Dam, Liam. Was wondering if there's any chance with grebes. Certainly, Spas. So we do on occasion see the little grebe swimming among these flamingos here at Comforts. Obviously a testament to the adaptability of those grebes, that they can make enough of a living in this fairly sodic, fairly caustic, salty water. That may even be a little grebe right up at the back there. I think it quite possibly is. Grebes, after all, are diving birds, very often feeding on aquatic plants and the little insects that occur on those aquatic plants in the water. Yeah, I think that is a little grebe right up in the top of the frame. I think you've got the spot just about right there, Nadine. I'm not quite sure. Maybe a little bit further up. Yeah, it can be a little bit tricky with these cameras. There is obviously something of a delay on them. Oh, there he is on the right by that bush again. Tricky to judge where he's going to come up. There we go. Got him. So certainly doing some ducking and some diving around some of the submerged old dead plant material. There's almost certainly going to be life forms existing around here. And that's what this little grebe is hoping for. Yeah, once again, always nice to take a look at some of the smaller things. It doesn't always have to be about the big high-profile species. They do capture so much of our attention otherwise. I think it's important to take a look at the other elements of biodiversity in these landscapes. After all of it has value, and I think if you're willing to give it some time and look closely enough, there is beauty in absolutely every living thing. As we panned for this little grebe, I think I may have even seen a springbok on the bank here. I wasn't aware that there were any mammals in this ecosystem, or any larger mammals, but apparently there are. Every day is a school day. Yeah, I believe this wetland is on land owned by one of the local diamond mines that Kimberley is obviously very famous for. And yeah, I think this is an effort in conjunction with a team of South African scientists, ornithologists, to conserve a little area of biodiversity. And nice to see a big conglomerate, a big wealthy company making a nice positive contribution to the environment. There he is. Well, there they are. Isn't that nice? And certainly with the presence of a much more significant grass layer here at Comfort's Dam, I would say these springbok have it a great deal easier than the ones at Okakoyo in Etosha. Nice example of a big ram on the right there, and what looks like two ewes, two females off on the left. You can see the very skinny horns of the females, and the rams are much thicker. Now the rams do all of the fighting, they're the ones that fight for dominance, but the females can be quite aggressive protectors of their lambs. I've certainly seen footage of them taking on things like black-backed jackals that are hoping to come in and kill the young ones. So I guess in an evolutionary sense it makes perfect sense for the females to have a very sharp set as well, so that they can have some chance of keeping their young safe. It is, however, quite unusual. We look at a lot of our other antelope species, kudu, nyala, impala, that sort of thing. We have very strong sexual dimorphism between male and female, in that males have horns and females have no horns at all. Of course, springbok are not the only ones where the females do have a set of horns. Things like eland, certainly roan, sable. Those cows and ewes do have sets of horns. And once again, these are horns, not antlers. It's the big kind of distinguishing characteristic between antelope here in Africa and deer and moose that occur in the northern hemisphere. Antelope horns last forever, they don't fall off, whereas the antlers of elk, moose, deer are shed annually and regrown. Now, quite interesting when we are given the opportunity to look at this springbok's face, if it does oblige us with a bit of a view. Springbok have got malar stripes, so that black mark kind of stretching down from their eye. Of course, Murphy's Law, now this guy won't face us. But it's a characteristic they actually share quite interestingly with one of their predators, which is, of course, the cheetah. And that black mark is thought to, there we go, a nice malar stripe. and is thought to draw glare out of that springbok and, in truth, the cheetah's eyes as well, giving it the ability to operate in conditions with very strong sunlight. Theoretically, very similar to the kind of charcoal marks, a bit like war paint, that American football players put on under their eyes to protect them from the glaring spotlights above those football fields. Yeah, interesting that predator and prey can share similar evolutionary characteristics. It's also reckoned that their very snowy white bellies are very effective at reflecting heat and light, which can be very problematic in a couple of the dry desert regions that they live in. If they had a brown belly or a black belly, for example, that would absorb a great deal more heat and light being reflected off of the surface beneath them, and as a result they probably need to consume more water. So yeah, these little antelope perfectly adapted to a life out in some very harsh conditions. But yeah, we are unfortunately fast approaching 2:30 p.m, at least where I am, and that marks the end of Live at the Waterhole for the day, unfortunately. But fear not, we'll be back same time tomorrow, where I'll be doing my last stint at Live at the Waterhole for a while. So be sure to check in with us again same time tomorrow. Yeah, all in all, it has been a very varied and quite interesting show, I think, with a good look at a couple of Africa's largest, and by all means, quite a host of the smaller species in these landscapes. Yeah, and as ever, Live at the Waterhole, you just never know what we're going to see next. That certainly keeps it interesting. Definitely keeps us as naturalists and directors on our toes. But for our entire Africam and Wild Earth team, all of the very skilled professionals behind the scenes, making all of the real magic happen and managing certain technical difficulties at times. So big thanks to the greater team, and yeah, certainly our directors Chulu initially and Nadine for the second half, as well as myself, Liam Burrow. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope wherever you are out there, you're having a nice Saturday. But from all of us, goodbye for now. Thanks, Nadine. We'll chat to you.
Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the tent here in Djuma Private Game Reserve. My name is Steve. I'm joined by Panda on camera, and this is On Safari.